Hello, good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, Transforming Built Infrastructure to Support Net Zero. I'm Rachel Cooper. I'm Distinguished Professor of Design Management and Policy at Lancaster University, and I'll be chairing this event. I have to say, I've been doing research in the construction and the built environment sector since 1995. So a lot of the issues that I think will be coming up today, I'm really interested in. A lot of the challenges I've heard about before, and it will be interesting to hear how they're being solved or how we need to solve them. So just to say hello to everybody. Today's event is being hosted by the N8 Research Partnership. The N8 Research Partnership was established 15 years ago in 2006. The N8 is a strategic collaboration between the 8 most research-intensive universities in the north of England. The partnership is committed to harnessing the university's diverse strengths to establish innovative research capabilities to support the economy of the north, as well as developing programs of national and international significance. Today's event focuses on the role the built infrastructure has to play on delivering carbon reductions in support of the UK's target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and in supporting a green recovery from the pandemic. Again, I would say, having worked in the construction and the built environment, some parts of it are not easy to change, and innovation is something that we really have to concentrate on in order to actually get to that net zero greenhouse emissions. And I'm looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say about the journey towards that. Turning to our speakers, we will be discussing how we can reimagine future homes and communities for better living, the challenges and opportunities facing existing communities, what's needed to support that change, how we can ensure that we are making effective decisions about construction interventions, and we will hear the real world experiences of delivering efficiency programs on a citywide basis. We hope that today's event will catalyse discussion and opportunities about the opportunities and challenges that await us in trying to reduce emissions from the construction sector, between not just the organisations represented on our panel today, but between yourselves and the organisations you represent. The N8 universities have a particular interest in this area, individually through excellent research that they undertake, and also through the Net Zero North programme. Now, the Net Zero North programme is being proposed to the government to support economic recovery from COVID and the levelling agenda to be driven by the green economy. There is significant opportunity for the construction centre to embrace and adopt and export our knowledge and expertise from the region nationally and globally. And I have to say, I know the N8 universities have this expertise because a few years ago, I travelled across the north, visiting each of those universities, looking at what they were doing in the built and urban environment, and there is a significant amount of expertise and knowledge. However, let me turn to today's agenda. I will shortly be asking each of our panellists to speak for 10 to 15 minutes in turn, and after all the presentations, we will have time to ask the panellists questions. So please, can you submit these as you're going along? You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, if you have any technical issues, please can you use the chat button to alert us to this. Please ensure that the option to send your message to all panelists is selected rather than all panelists and attendees. Have you got those instructions? So if you have any technical issues, send a message in chat. And we would also like to encourage you to post your thoughts on the webinar on social media using the hashtag #NetZeroNorth. Finally, a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to watch back after the event. All attendees will be sent a link to the recording once it's available. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist and speaker, Susie Jones. Susie is Director of the Future Lab at House by Urban Splash, and Susie was formerly director of RIBA North. So Susie, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm really delighted that I've been asked to join this webinar. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm the director of Future Lab, which is the research and innovation division of House by Urban Splash. I'm just going to make sure I've got control over the slides, which I think I have. So Urban Splash, House by Urban Splash is the new build arm of Urban Splash, which uses modern methods of construction to build new homes in our factory in Alfreton. To begin with, I'm going to talk to you about the history of reuse in Urban Splash and why at points this hasn't been fashionable. But then I want to tell you about the things that we're working on in Future Lab that we think will shape the future of the industry and why reuse is a fundamental part of that story. So retrofit or reuse is Urban Splash's bread and butter. The majority of the buildings which Splash have renovated over the past 27 years were earmarked for demolition. And this is Park Hill in Sheffield, which is one of our more recent developments. At that point, at the beginning of the story of Urban Splash, the reuse of existing buildings was far from fashionable. No one could see a viable future for buildings which Splash ultimately has won over 400 awards for transforming. I mean, the industry can be quite risk averse and traditional in lots of ways. And in the early years of Urban Splash, and to some extent still now, developers had one type of product that they would focus on. So you would have housing developers, office developers, retail developers, and each developer would have a kind of spreadsheet formula, which worked incredibly well, was very successful. But when schemes or buildings didn't fit that formula, the argument was generally made to demolish the building and build new. Urban Splash doesn't do that. It's not to say they haven't built new buildings, but they don't take that approach to sites. We see the building, if it exists already, and work out what formula is needed case by case to make it successful. And Urban Splash has been enormously successful doing that and has arguably shaped the landscape of our cities as a result, retaining lots of amazing buildings and developing them for lots of different types of purposes. But it's not been straightforward. Over the last 27 years, Urban Splash has constantly been told it will never work, which was in fact the title of the exhibition they produced in 2018 to celebrate their 25th anniversary. I seem to have lost control of the slides. Okay, here we go. It's just a bit slow, so bear with me. Just trying to go back one. So when the company was first established, Tom and Jonathan, who are the co-founders of the company, and their friends wanted to live in the city centre, in loft-style accommodation. But at that time, no one was investing in city centres, and definitely not in this type of accommodation. Like the buildings themselves, nobody could see a viable future in them. So Urban Splash set about shaping the future they envisaged, and in doing so, shaped the industry itself. Now retrofit is seen as one of the ways in which the construction industry can limit its planetary impact. We have this event, of course, and there's things like the AJ Retro First campaign and lots of momentum to look at retrofit as a means of limiting the amount of carbon and waste that the industry produces. That's not always been the case. And in 1996, Urban Splash bought Fort Dunlop, which didn't look like this when they bought it, but you've probably seen it if you've ever driven up and down the M6. Fort Dunlop is a multi-use development, and it includes over 300,000 square feet of office space, which is a lot of office space to sell. And at the time, our agents kept telling us that it will never work, and that in order to sell those units, we needed to get BREEAM Excellence ratings, which is an environmental stamp. But Fort Dunlop wasn't eligible for BREEAM ratings because it was an existing building. The only way that we could get it would have been to have knocked it down and to have built something from scratch. And Splash believe in reuse, and although it's harder to sell, refused to knock down the building and start again. So how does all this relate to a new build house company? House, like Urban Splash, already does things very differently to the majority of the traditional house building company, the traditional house building industry. We build our own home, we build our homes in a factory. We design to a very high specification and we deliver homes with huge windows and really high ceilings. But there's lots more we want to do. There are several planetary scale challenges facing us all which must be addressed. To do so, Urban Splash has established Future Lab. Future Lab is relatively new. I was appointed, sorry, I'm really struggling with the slides going backwards and forwards, so I apologise for that. I was appointed 6 months ago and we haven't really talked about it publicly in much detail. So you're probably getting a bit of a scoop today, but Future Lab is a space within the company to look beyond immediate horizons. So beyond the here and now at kind of 5, 10, 50 years in the future, at the impact of things like demographic and societal shifts. I'm sorry, these next 3 slides probably won't work properly because they're supposed to be done quickly in succession. And I don't think that the technology can handle that. But so we look at these 3 things: people, planet, and progress. Those are people is really around demographic and societal shifts. Planet, when we talk about planet, we're looking at things like climate and ecological crisis. And under progress, we're interested in the ways in which technological the impact of technological advancements on the ways in which we may need and want to live in the future. So in Future Lab, we take on really large scale ambitious projects which aim to find solutions to some of those challenges that we face. Our projects are speculative. Okay, that's not me moving the slides, so I'm just gonna leave it there. Thanks. So our projects are speculative, but they're rooted in finding viable solutions which can be adopted and then applied to the development of our homes and our communities. We're working on multiple projects at the moment. All are in really early stages, but there are 2 which give you some insight into what the future of the industry could and potentially should be like. So next slide. The first of those projects I want to talk about is called Project Meadow. I mean, I can't say too much about Project Meadow because it's currently embargoed, but what I can tell you is that we're exploring the ways in which we can digitize our entire end-to-end processes, from design through configuration, manufacturing, construction, and post-occupancy, to build an ongoing relationship with our customers that potentially lasts until the end of the product lifecycle. This digitization of our product and its lifespan has an enormous benefit, not only to the customer and the customer's experience, but also when we're thinking about the product itself, its materiality, its adaptability, and really its whole life cycle. So Project Meadow has got a slightly different application, but the underlying potential benefits of that end-to-end digitization are considerable, being able to track elements of our products from supply chain all the way through to the end of the product's lifespan. Okay, next slide. The second project I wanted to highlight is so new. In fact, we don't have a name for it. It began as a detailed carbon analysis of our existing products, processes, and corporate assets. And we've been working with Arup to determine where the opportunities for environmental improvements are. The role of Future Lab is to develop, test, and then to demonstrate the potential for the ways in which we might then make those improvements. And I can't really express enough how early on we are in the process, but I thought in terms of provocation through this talk, I'd let you know a little bit about our thinking. So in this diagram, you can see that we know that our products and processes perform incredibly well. This graph shows we are already exceeding all standardized 2020 carbon targets. So next slide. And so our current carbon credentials are good, but as we expand to deliver For example, in between 2023 and 24, they deliver 3,000 homes per annum. Our carbon, if we stay where we are now with the current products and processes, our carbon footprint increases exponentially. So our challenge is now to address this with various scales of interventions and innovations between now and that point. And there's some really simple quick wins that we that will have significant impacts on our scope 1 emissions, for example, decarbonising our factory energy supply. But for Future Lab, what we're looking at are the larger scale shifts in our thinking. So next slide. For example, how do we introduce circular thinking and circular practices? Our existing carbon credentials are good, but if we don't deal with the timber effectively at the end of the product's life cycle, we'll undo all of that good work. And we need to look at ways in which we can reuse as much timber as possible and design the ability to do that into the products and processes. Hence the benefits of the previous project, Project Meadow, and being able to track those materials through the lifespan of an individual home. We're interested in the ways in which reusing the materials in our homes can be an intrinsic part of the way in which we design. Next slide. But secondly, how can we further expand that circular thinking into the vertical integration of our company? So Future Lab is beginning to ask questions like, can we own a forest? Can we own a permaculture forest which retains the carbon in our materials at the end of their life and provides new timber for future products? Can our forest contain a timber processing plant? Can it also contain our house manufacturing facility, localizing the timber supply chain? And can our forest-based processing and manufacturing plant build a community for its workers, for example? And of course, I don't have the answers to these questions. We've got a long way to go to explore them fully. But I think what it does do is give a sense of the ways in which we need to be thinking about the future of construction end to end. Okay, last slide. So we have a history of reuse. It's embedded in the fabric of the company. We now have a new build arm of the company. How do we design our new products from scratch to make sure that we're reusing materials at the end of their life? So how do we value reuse in new building in the same way that we've always done when we're retrofitting? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susie. That was great. I did a piece of research with Urban Splash 20 years ago, comparing offsite manufacture with the traditional build. So I can see it's gone a long way since then. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Danielle Tingley. Danielle is Senior Lecturer in Architectural Engineering at the University of Sheffield. Danielle's research explores sustainable building design solutions, as well as exploring how understanding existing built environment stocks enable strategic retrofit, material salvage and reuse. Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It's great to be here. And Susie, that was really interesting. So look forward to the discussion coming up. So let me just see if I can make the slides work. Beautiful, yes. So I'm going to talk particularly about the role of domestic retrofit in UK decarbonisation. So first off, why domestic retrofit? Why is it important for us to meet our decarbonisation targets? Well, greenhouse gas emissions from the residential sector accounted for around 16% of the UK's total emissions in 2019. Achieving net zero emission goals will be basically impossible if we can't decarbonise our existing residential stock. The majority of our housing stock still uses gas, a fossil fuel, as its main heating source. So there's a series of very big challenges there in retrofitting our stock, really. But what about the scale of this challenge? How big a problem is it? Just see if I can get, there we go. So if we zoom down to England, there are nearly 23 million houses in England alone. Only 1% of the housing stock actually meets modern standards of thermal efficiency, which in themselves are insufficient if we're going to deliver net zero. This means pretty much most houses we build now, we're still going to have to retrofit in the coming decades to deliver net zero by 2050. We have a very old stock, which is fairly well known. And that's actually a really good thing, as Susie was saying, from an embodied carbon perspective. If we don't demolish it and rebuild it. But we do need to think about how we retrofit it to improve those operational standards. And heating is really one of our key challenges. As I said, gas is a key heating supply. And it's very difficult to actually simply electrify the systems, partly because of that's 23 million houses, or almost, that you're going to have to try and retrofit. But it would also be very difficult to shift that current gas demand straight onto the electricity grid, given current capacity in the power network across generation, transmission and distribution. Even more so if you also think about the wider systemic changes, like potentially shifting to more electric vehicles, that's going to put even more pressure on that electricity grid. And there are, of course, a series of wider drivers and indeed challenges for retrofit at this scale. A key driver is that 4 million households in the UK are in fuel poverty. That means they can't afford to heat their homes. Arguably, they should be targeted for retrofit interventions first, so that they are lifted out of fuel poverty. The impact of cold homes on health and the then knock-on impact this has on the NHS also has a societal cost. And of course, one of the key challenges with retrofit is actually the cost of doing it, particularly when you look at the individual householder and whether they can afford it and what the mechanisms are there. So that hopefully gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge. Now, what we need to think about beyond this is those materials we're going to use. So if we need to retrofit our 23 million homes, surely that's going to require an awful lot of materials to actually bring them up to these standards that we need to deliver net zero. What about the embodied emissions of those materials? Do they matter? So this is something we started to explore. And we looked, kind of zooming down a scale again, at the Victorian housing stock within England. So kind of some of our oldest stock, generally solid wall. And we looked at what the carbon payback was for solid wall insulation. So how quickly our embodied emissions would pay back in operational savings. And actually what we found was for pretty much all materials, with the exception of aerogel, which I'll touch on in a second, they're paying back incredibly quickly. So all of them within 5 years, and the majority within kind of 1 to 2 years. And this is looking at scale. And that really is showing that, yes, it's absolutely worthwhile from a whole life carbon perspective to retrofit our stock. Those operational emissions are dwarfing the embodied emissions. There are specialist materials like aerogel, which you're not likely to, retrofit at scale with that material anyway. It's very energy intensive, and you're going to use that for very specific purposes. Very thin material, so does have certain benefits. So that's what we saw, that it was worthwhile doing this. But does that actually mean we get enough savings? How much of a difference would this make if we retrofit all of England's Victorian housing with solid wall insulation? So here you can see the accumulated carbon savings up to 2050 if we retrofitted the whole stock, looking at 6 different scenarios, installation scenarios. The lowest installation scenario, S1, is at our current rates of installing solid wall insulation. So pretty slow rates, and therefore pretty slow accumulation of carbon savings. Our best S6 scenarios is if we said, you know what, we need to take action now, it's a climate emergency, and we retrofit the whole of the stock this year. So obviously, the faster we retrofit, the quicker we get those operational benefits, as you'd expect. The S5 scenario is what's within the Committee on Climate Change's modelling around needed retrofit measures, so around 90,000 installations a year. Now, this graph does show what the benefits would be if we didn't change our heating systems. So it's looking at using basically how much gas you might displace, and the savings, the carbon savings from displacing gas. If we were to decarbonise our energy system, so shifting away from gas, we would of course have lower carbon savings as a result from retrofitting with solid wall. So we have, at maximum, if we retrofitted everything at once, 268 megatons of CO2 equivalent. It's always difficult when talking about megatons of CO2. How much is that? Is it a lot? Well, that's almost 4 times a single year's emissions from the UK housing stock. So it's not inconsiderable, but it's not really enough to get us to where we need to by 2050. That's not delivering net zero, is it? So what we then looked at is what happened if we looked across the whole stock. So if we look at our UK decarbonisation targets and the kind of trajectory we need to get to, so by 2050 we need to be at zero, We also have a kind of carbon budget that you can allocate based on staying within 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. So we have a global budget that we could ratio down to a national level. So if we were taking that potentially national budget and ratioing it down to a residential carbon budget, so an amount of carbon we can use within our homes. We've done this ratio fairly crudely just based on the current share of domestic emissions, but it gives you a feel for how much carbon we might have to spend, as it were, until 2050. We worked this budget out on 2 bases. One looking at the Committee on Climate Change's kind of estimates of the carbon budget, and the other looking at the Tyndall Centre at Manchester's estimations of what our carbon budget would be. The Tyndall Centre number is a lot lower because the stance they take is that to be Paris compliant, that the UK should actually be taking a steeper cut in its emissions compared to, say, developing countries, given our kind of historical emissions and the fact that we already developed. So actually we should be taking a deeper cut in emissions to allow other nations that haven't developed to develop. But that gives us a boundary, that gives us a feel for how much carbon we might have to play with. So what we then did was look to see what retrofit measures we actually need to deploy across England's stock to stay within both of those carbon budgets. Is it possible? Can we actually do it? Can we stay within our carbon budgets? Now, this is a fairly complicated graph, but I'll just talk it through. So what we see here is a series of different individual measures, retrofit measures, so insulation measures, glazing, double and triple glazing, and installation of heat pumps, and then a series of combined measures. Now, what we can clearly see is if we were going to stay within the Committee on Climate Change budget, is the only measure that would be possible to deploy is going to be a heat pump that would stay within that budget. Now, the challenge with shifting the whole system to a heat pump, forget for a second the logistical challenges of doing that, it's also that heat pumps run at much lower temperatures than our typical heating systems. This generally means to provide thermal comfort, you need to have a very well insulated stock. So ideally, we are going to then need to combine those heat pumps with our kind of full insulation scenarios and possibly better glazing as well. And we can see, hopefully, yeah, so there's a little green box that's appeared around those 2 kind of mixed scenarios where we've got heat pumps and all wall insulation. And only by combining those 2 is when we might be able to meet the stricter Tyndall budget under certain electricity grid decarbonisation scenarios. So really this is saying this is incredibly, incredibly challenging to do. So we need to retrofit all of the stock to be able to meet these budgets. What is perhaps, in my mind, slightly terrifying is the basis that we did this modelling on was retrofitting everything this year, because that was our starting point. So that really shows you that we need incredibly urgent action. So if we need to retrofit every eligible house in England this year to meet the stricter Tyndall budgets, we might have a little bit more play with the Committee on Climate Change budgets. We need to do something quick, and current government targets fall very far short of being able to meet these budgets. We urgently need new legislation, incentives and financial support to actually be able to increase the pace and scale of retrofit if we're to meet our decarbonisation targets. Of course, there's a series of challenges to actually physically be able to do that, but we wanted to see what was possible and how quickly we had to act, hopefully to encourage people to act faster than we currently are. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you all for listening, and thanks to my co-authors as well for all that work.
Thank you very much, Danielle. That's that really puts our minds thinking straight to the point, doesn't it? Really. I'm looking forward to the discussion about that challenge. So our next speaker today is Brian Robson. Brian is Executive Director of the Policy and Affairs at the Northern Housing Consortium. The Northern Housing Consortium represents the views of housing association organisations across the north of England. Brian has previously worked for Homes England in Policy and Strategy and for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as Head of Policy and Research, I think in housing rather than everything that Joseph Rowntree does. So Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much to the N8 for the invitation to join you today. And what I'm going to say, I think, follows on quite nicely from Danielle's presentation, although I'm slightly terrified by some of the numbers she presented. Just move on the slides. That's it, yeah. So yeah, I think it's very much not about if we do this, but how we do this. As Rachel said, the Northern Housing Consortium are the voice of housing in the north of England. We have 140 members who are councils, housing associations, ALMOs, and combined authorities across the north. And those members kind of collectively provide 96% of social housing in the north of England. And our members are really serious about net zero. Half our members are councils, and over 60 of them have now declared climate emergencies. And housing associations and ALMOs are responding and adopting ambitious plans to decarbonise. And that's, as Danielle explained, completely necessary because of the amount of our emissions that come from our existing homes. So housing will have a huge role in the north meeting the challenge of net zero. And that's very much why it's not if we do this, but how we do it. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to deliver on two of the government's top priorities at once, to deliver on levelling up and to deliver on net zero. The Prime Minister is clearly claims to be committed to uniting and levelling up the country. We think that for us, that means creating good green jobs, which are needed now post-COVID as much as ever, and also levelling up the quality of our homes, which are older and colder than the national average. So we have more of those solid wall properties that Danielle was talking about in the north of England compared to the national average. The Prime Minister is also committed to reaching net zero. It was one of only 6 points in his guarantee to voters at the election in 2019. I think that's encouraging. It suggests it's not just an afterthought, but something that's front and centre of the government's plans and something they need to demonstrate progress on. And in the housing sector in the north of England, we think there's an opportunity to deliver on both of those things at once through a large-scale retrofit programme in our existing homes. So to demonstrate how we might deliver on this, the NHC have worked with IPPR North, who are a dedicated think tank for the north of England, to develop a pathway to decarbonise our existing homes as a green recovery plan to decarbonise homes in the north. And we think there's potential to create 77,000 good green jobs here in the north of England by 2035. And that would involve retrofit measures in over 5 million homes and have a huge economic impact. The pathway we developed is phased. So we propose starting in the social housing sector, readying those homes for net zero first, because we think that offers a real opportunity to build the skills and supply chains that we're going to need to decarbonise all the homes we have in the north of England. Now, as Danielle described, the poorest standards are often in the solid wall properties. They're very often in the private rented and owner-occupied sectors. But we think starting in the social housing sector makes sense because the sector owns and manages over 1 million homes in the north of England, about 1 in 6 homes in the region. So that means the sector can place some big bets, place some big orders, inject certainty into the supply chain in a way that vouchers for individual homeowners can't do, or regulating the hundreds of thousands of individual private landlords we have in the north of England can't do at scale. And that scale of demand, I think, is what we need now in order to build the skills and capacity that's going to be necessary to take on this huge task. The sector also has a track record delivering similar improvements at scale. So we delivered the Decent Homes programme in the 2000s. That was improvements to around 1 million homes in the north of England, new kitchens, new bathrooms, massive programme of work. And the sector can also bring significant resources of its own to the table. So we support 100,000 jobs in the north already, and we're a £10 billion sector in the north of England. So we have a large turnover, large financial capacity. I just wanted to highlight 3 challenges I think we face in actually pulling this off. The first is around capacity. So I said the sector has significant resources, and that's true, but it also faces significant competing demands for those resources at present. And I describe them really as a kind of 3-way trade-off. So kind of post-Grenfell, it's obviously absolutely imperative that all our homes are safe to live in, and there's costs of remediating things that shouldn't have been put on homes in the first place, but there's also a new building safety regime coming down the track, and it's absolutely imperative the sector gets that right. It will be the top priority for boards, for housing committees, for management teams across the north and the rest of the country. We also expect a revised Decent Homes standard from the government as part of their social housing white paper commitments, and the NHC are core participants with NHCLG in developing that work. But the combination of those things is likely to add to the asset management costs of maintaining our existing homes, so maintaining our upgrade upgrading our existing homes outside of net zero. The sector is also obviously keen to build new homes. We aren't building enough as a country or in the north of England, and the government has a target of 300,000 new homes a year. And the Ministry of Housing and Homes England, the government's housing agency, rightly see the social sector playing a big role in helping them meet that target. And the demand is particularly acute at the bottom end of the market for people on lower incomes who social housing traditionally serves. And Homes England are offering long-term strategic partnerships to housing associations to allow them to stretch their resources and stretch that delivery further. So those two demands on capacity in both areas, government has committed financial capacity to the sector to help us deliver. We know what government's bringing to the table, and that means that the sector, housing associations and councils can plan on that basis. But then we have net zero, and housing organisations are expecting this to add somewhere between £15,000 to £20,000 per home to their asset management costs in the coming period. And within government, obviously that agenda is driven by BEIS. So there's a three-way trade-off, I think, for boards and for housing committees and councils. Do you reduce development and reduce the number of new homes you deliver in order to invest in existing homes? And that's a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma for housing organisations at the moment. Government, as I say, has been clear about what it's offering in terms of funding for building safety and funding for new homes. But what we're missing at the moment is the equivalent commitment on net zero. The Conservative manifesto promised £3.8 billion for a social housing decarbonisation fund. This year, we have £60 million for the whole country. And we're awaiting news at the spending review on that larger sum of money. So it's very difficult, I think, for the sector to make long-term decisions about large-scale investment until we know what government's bringing to the table. So I think what we really need is a whole government view of the demands on the sector so that we can maximise impact on all three of these big demands. And our ask to support this is that at the spending review, Rishi Sunak brings forward that social housing decarbonisation fund promised in the Conservative manifesto. Opening that up would allow us to get started on the pathway. But if we want to deliver at the scale, somewhere at the scale that's needed, at the scale we propose in the Northern Power Homes report, then we need a commitment from government of around £1 billion per year for the North alone. All of that will be matched with investment for social landlords' own resources. And as I say, we'll be building the skills and supply chain we need to deliver in future in other parts of the housing market. So all eyes really on the spending review to understand what we're going to be able to do in coming years. The second challenge, I think, is that some of the technologies we need to deploy at scale are more costly and are unfamiliar, and that is holding back adoption at scale at present. So, for example, around heat pumps, there is a cost premium on heat pumps over the energy efficient boilers that we install at present. We all know we need to make this switch, but it's currently more expensive than the alternative. They're also unfamiliar. I use the word unfamiliar deliberately. They're not unproven. Heat pumps are used all across the world. I'm right in saying if we had the same penetration of heat pumps in the UK that Norway does, we'd already have 15 million heat pumps in use in the UK. But at the moment, we're installing 30,000 a year compared to 1.6 million boilers. Government's own target is to get that to 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. And we're awaiting a heat and building strategy, which I think will be really helpful in setting clear expectations around what government sees the shift being. And that will hopefully encourage industry and the supply chain to gear up. But they are unfamiliar at the moment, and a challenge for the social housing sector, I think, is to increase confidence in these technologies, not just amongst landlord staff, but also amongst tenants. Because at the end of the day, these are people's homes, and we've got a big job of work to do to understand their hopes and fears and how to generate demand and acceptance for these new technologies from tenants. And at the NHC, we're hoping to run a tenant jury later this year, a deliberative democracy project, to discuss decarbonisation with tenants and understand what they would recommend and how they would like to see landlords approaching this. Third challenge, which links really, is skills and supply chains. We have 100,000 registered gas engineers in the UK. We have 600 heat pump installers. So we don't have the skilled workers at present with the right skills, the right training, the right accreditation to take on the scale of home improvement that we need to do in the North. So we need to retrofit our skills system too, to train a new generation of workers, to retrain some people whose existing skills are going to be in less demand going forward. And I think that's really exciting, and I really welcome the work that N8 are doing on this. It's not just about heat pumps and heating systems. We're also going to need more plasterers, for example, if we're going to do this right. So that training work needs to start now, because it's going to take a couple of years to train people up. And as Danielle has described, we need to be getting on with this as soon as possible. Social landlords are obviously also interested in the opportunity to help social housing tenants into these roles. We already offer a range of employability support to tenants, including work readiness and so on. So there's big potential there, big potential opportunity to create local roles that tenants can do, upgrading homes in their area. And then finally on supply chain, we've seen with the Green Homes Grant that the lack of accredited retrofit assessors and installers has held back progress. There's also been massive problems with the administration of that scheme. I'm involved in some of the local authority delivery elements of the Green Homes Grant in the North East, which is going well so far. But even that limited programme is really stretching the supply chains and skills we have in the region. The programme ends at the end of 2021, and we lack the long-term certainty to offer the supply chain so that they can increase their skills and capacity. So I think we need to stop turning the tap on and off, stop these stop-starts approach to policy, and really offer the supply chain some long-term certainty. And I think if we can do that, there are exciting opportunities we can unlock in the north, in the supply chain, in installation, perhaps in manufacturing some of these components that are going to be in really high demand in the years to come. This is what the social sector is doing. We're trying to aggregate demand through consortia arrangements that will hopefully bring the price down, but also give the supply chain certainty. The NHC is involved in some of those arrangements. We're also collaborating to understand the scale of demand we can support and working to communicate that to the supply chain. So that work's been done in Greater Manchester, and we're leading a group of housing organisations in the North East as part of the North East Climate Coalition, where we really want to map future demand there and share that with the supply chain so that they can gear up with confidence. So some challenges, but I think also huge opportunity to change lives, change places. We also talked a lot about jobs and supply chains, but this is also about tackling fuel poverty that blights our region, about creating warmer and healthier homes. And if we get it right, also lifting the fabric of streets and estates across the north. Potential for 77,000 good green jobs across the north. And I think our biggest ask really is around this long-term certainty from government, because that unlocks a hell of a lot. It enables social landlords to be clear about the scale of their programme and enables the supply chain to ramp up their capacity to the appropriate level. So it's very much over to you, Rishi. And speaking of which, this is a home in his constituency, which has been retrofitted by the local housing association. It's saving the resident there £300 a year on their energy bills at the moment. As I say, it's not a question of whether we can do it. It's not even a question of if we do it. It's very much a question of just how we're going to do it and how much of it we can get done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Long-term certainty from the government. Are you mad? Anyway, and now to our final speaker, Bradford Swing. Bradford is Director of Energy Policy and Programmes, and for 2 decades has been at the heart of Boston's energy efficiency actions. Brad, I love Boston, so one of my favourite cities in the US. Brad has implemented programs in energy efficiency for municipal buildings, leading to Boston's first green bonds issue, coordinating utility infrastructure, as well as initiating district energy, microgrid, and solar building programs. So over to you, Brad.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here speaking to the northeast of England. My father grew up in the southwest in Totnes, Devon. Let's see, do I have slide control? Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to speak about Boston's energy work in general, hopefully quite quickly and directly, so that I can land on some points I'd like to make about Boston's experience in trying to do comprehensive retrofits of residential units in our city. So the first thing to say is that in the United States, we're the capital city of New England. We're nested within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we have no control over our energy systems. And so all the utility regulation, all the rebate work for advanced energy, clean energy, heat pumps, that sort of thing, all happens at the state level. So I have been at this for a long time, and I identified the opportunity to start focusing on energy and sat down with the mayor of Boston and said, let's do this. And he said, why would I do this, Brad? It's a fight among state agencies. And I made the economic development argument that a city like Boston, which has many important labs and financial institutions, that we wanted a much more advanced grid, that we needed to do what we could to promote the kind of modern energy system that we need. Next slide, please. So Boston's energy program today, we have a couple premier programs. One of them is the Renew Boston Trust. This is an energy savings performance contracting program, kind of like Retrofit London, I believe that was called. I actually worked with a consultant that helped the Greater London Authority start with performance contracting 10 or 15 years ago. We have a municipal energy unit, an alternative finance unit. We have a self-funded, completely, adding to our budget capacity energy efficiency program for our own municipal buildings. This is a solar canopy we just dedicated last week at our police department headquarters. We also have a municipal aggregation just starting February 1st under a state statute. We are now purchasing the electricity supply for our residents and businesses. They can opt out. The buying power allows us to increase renewable energy content overall, and it's a big part of our carbon plan. Next slide, please. The third premier way we work on energy in Boston city government is actually at our planning and development agency. This is a policy and program that I worked for many years to create. It's an integrated utility planning program. We work on advanced energy feasibility assessments for microgrids, solar battery backup, green infrastructure, as you can see the list here. Basically, we work on what we have jurisdiction over. Back to that first slide, really the only thing we have direct jurisdiction over is what's underneath our streets. And so we took that basic fact and reality and said, okay, if anyone needs a permit to open up our streets, we can do a lot about demanding more advanced utility infrastructure integration as we deal with major projects going through our development review process. We have only the zoning code by which to regulate buildings, because as I showed in the first slide again, the building code and the energy code are governed by state law. But what I like particularly about the smart utilities policy is that it's an interdepartmental, interagency grouping that has been together now for 4 years and can really work on making technology decisions that make sense for all the departments of Boston government. Next slide, please. So I have heard very much that the focus of this discussion is on buildings work. So this is actually my last slide, and just in essence, an outline of what we have done with buildings work. So we started actually with a pilot green building. It was my very first energy oriented project. The design and construction of this happened in Boston starting in 1999. We were not allowed under state law to procure a design build project using government funds. Fortunately, we had a trust fund that paid for the design and construction of this pilot green building. It was the first building in Boston that had a geothermal heat pump. Many, many lessons learned on life cycle cost accounting and upfront integrated design. And this project really grounded the policy development towards citywide green building zoning requirements in 2007. And so we had a task force that met for a year, and they recommended that we adopt the very early emerging leadership in energy and environmental design LEED ratings, and we required private developers to build to a basic green standard. So we're now underway to upgrade the zoning with a zero net carbon building upgrade. Sorry, I'm just looking at my clock. And this work is ongoing. There's a technical advisory group working on low carbon buildings, on-site renewable energy procurement, as you see here. So that will be an upgrade to this zoning code that is our way of requiring those going through development review with Boston to improve their buildings. We have an energy reporting and disclosure ordinance on the books that requires buildings above 35,000 square feet to report energy usage. And a very consequential chunk of work is ongoing there, where we hope to implement a carbon performance standard to have a technology neutral way of having all the buildings in Boston above a certain threshold achieve a carbon neutral operation by 2050 per our goals, and with goals in between. What I'm really going to land on here is my experience with community energy efficiency programs. So in Massachusetts, this work is administered by our utilities. We have a deregulated utility market in Boston and Massachusetts. So I work with an investor-owned electric utility, and they're required by our state government to administer very well-funded energy efficiency programs. We pay a millage on our electric and natural gas bills to fund this work. When I started to really think about what was a way to bring Boston into this state-governed energy picture, I was working on this green building that I mentioned, and the mayor at the time, Tom Menino, we were at an event related to that green building, and he said to me, he said, look, here's a woman who lives on my street. She doesn't understand what you're talking about. You've got to bring the science to the sidewalk. You have got to find a way to make this relevant to the regular Bostonian. And then he said something that changed my life. If you don't improve the life of this resident today, I don't want you to come to work tomorrow. So I started to realize that I needed to figure out a way to intervene in this state-governed utility administered efficiency program, and to make sure that Boston residents and the building types in urban areas were well served. These efficiency programs, just by dint of the way in which a retrofit of a residence works most easily, they were connecting the resources of these efficiency programs with single family homes with attics and basements in our suburbs that were owned and occupied often by highly professional people dedicated to climate change issues and willing to be home the 4 or 5 times that you need technicians to touch the home, to evaluate, do the efficiency upgrade, and then the monitoring and verification. What we were discovering is that we were not getting anything like the money we were paying on our systems benefit charge to the statewide utility programs back, nor were there programs that were addressing the 67% of our residents who are renters, or the kind of building stock that is in much of Boston, connected row homes, large apartment buildings, and that sort. And so I worked with the state legislature to get a seat for cities and towns to be included on a body that oversees the formation of these efficiency programs called the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council. And I served on that for 6 years. And we did a lot of work to try to get programs that serve renters and address these issues in a much more comprehensive way. This was happening at the same time as the first American Recovery Act was happening. Just yesterday, you may have seen that the American Rescue Plan passed Congress. It's the most consequential piece of legislation I have ever seen in my lifetime. I could not be more thrilled about the redirection of American government. In 2009, President Obama passed a large American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It included resources for all American cities above 35,000 to do energy efficiency work. I received $6.5 million to build my energy program, to build that municipal energy unit, that alternative finance unit, all the work that I outlined so very quickly at the beginning. What we did with that Recovery Act funding 10 years ago was that we had extensive community outreach to Boston's residents and businesses. And we asked them to participate in this state-governed, utility-administered efficiency program, and we filled the rebate gap. So without the rebate gap, you'd get a $2,000 insulation job, you'd have to pay $600 bucks. We paid that extra $600. We were essentially giving free residential retrofits. And my message to you is touching residential homes. When I hear people talk about retrofitting 23 million houses, I kind of take a deep breath. And the reason is because I had experience trying to give away retrofits of residential homes. And when we explained what was involved with this, how many times you would have to be home, over and over again, we would hear, I am an hourly worker. Are you going to pay me what I'm missing from my job? Otherwise, I'm not interested. Door slam. And, you know, touching people's homes is unbelievably intimate, and it requires an enormous amount of sensitive administration of lots of complaints, lots of concerns from people as workers are in their homes. And I just implore people to think about what needs to change quite comprehensively about our community outreach. If we're going to retrofit all the residences on this planet in order to achieve the kind of carbon goals we need to achieve, there needs to be a wholesale rethinking of what is truly involved in touching people's homes, particularly low-income people who rent, who are hourly workers. You cannot expect them to lose money to retrofit their home. So that's my final message. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you to all our speakers. I think Brad has summed up quite a lot of challenges there. So we'll now move on to the Q&A session, and we have a number of questions, and I think I can categorize them, and I think we'll start with questions that lead off from Brad, which is the practicalities of delivering this change in the built environment. The whole issue of the behavioral aspects rather than the technology. Although we're talking to the construction industry, we've got colleagues working in that industry. And we will come on to what I'd call some of the technical questions around energy and the technology. Perhaps we can start, perhaps I can ask the panelists, you know, how these challenges and this challenge of what I call dealing with everyday people. I love that phrase that Brad said, bring the science to the sidewalk. I mean, and the fact that we have, you know, some of our population are people who understand the challenge, but I would say a lot of the population don't understand the challenge and don't understand what might need to happen to their homes, whether rented or owned or part of a housing association, what needs to happen to it and how we can do that at pace with their cooperation. So I'm going to turn to each panelist and ask what they think is the best way, what they think are the triggers that can do that. And as Brad finished, maybe I'll come to him at the end. So let's start with, is Susie back? Because I know she had to leave. Not sure whether she's back or not.
I don't think she is.
Oh yeah. Well, we'll start with Danielle then. Danielle.
Well, I think there's a series of challenges, really. I guess it varies so much depending on what the interventions are you need to make as well, because I think some require a lot more kind of discussion. And, you know, if you're going to install a heat pump, the massive overhaul of how people, you know, are using their heating system, fundamentally, there's a whole series of things that you need to have a conversation about there. Whereas external wall insulation, for example, I got my gable wall insulated, and because it was outside, they literally, I only had to be in for the initial quotation, which we did on a Saturday, and then the rest of it they came and did when I wasn't in, because I was like, I'm at work, can you just get on with it? And they said yes, and I'd check it when I came home in the evening. And so that worked really well. So I think it does massively depend on which interventions we're talking about.
Yeah.
And some of those wider benefits as well. So some work I did probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, looking at retrofit measures in the north of England, in particularly deprived communities. For them, the real benefit that they saw after retrofit, and that's when they then went to their neighbours and said, we should really be doing more of this, was the aesthetic improvements to their home as well. Actually, the energy efficiency they weren't so bothered about, but their home suddenly looked brighter, cleaner, and it meant they took more care of the streets, they were saying. And so those sort of wider benefits, I think we don't talk about enough, and perhaps letting, once you've got that kind of an initial intervention that's hopefully successful, using that as a way to also communicate more broadly, I think is really important. So it's not necessarily me going in as an academic and saying, but isn't this wonderful? It's more community kind of conversations as well. I think for me is very important.
The sort of viral effect. Yeah. Brian, what's your view in terms of a housing, the housing associations and what they can do to stimulate that sort of, oh, it's been, somebody else has had it done, it's not that bad, or how do you approach it?
Yeah, I referred to this briefly in the presentation. I agree with Brad that it's a real challenge, because these are people's homes at the end of the day, and we can't sit in offices and decide that we're going to do this to people. We need to do it with them. I think we built up a lot of expertise in the sector when we did the homes programme in terms of how to effectively engage with tenants and managing some of the issues Brad was describing about their availability to let people in and so on. But the issue with the Decent Homes programme was you were getting a new kitchen or bathroom as part of it. So it was a very tangible benefit to you on a day-to-day basis. The issue that I perceive with this is, particularly around replacing heating systems, you might be replacing a system that the tenant's very happy with and knows how to operate, is quite used to, quite familiar with. And it's kind of, well, what's the benefit to me for what could be quite a lot of disruption if we're also replacing pipes and radiators to service that new electrified heating source. And that's why we want to run this tenant jury and engage kind of on an adult-to-adult basis with tenants and say, this is the climate science. We need to do this as a nation. How can we best do this with you? And what would you recommend to us as landlords about how you would like this programme to proceed? There are some opportunities, as Danielle described, in terms of upgrading whole streets and making neighbourhoods look and feel better. And that was one of the things we didn't get around to with the Decent Homes programme. It's very much work that took place inside homes, and there's an opportunity to lift the exterior of homes this time. And also that enhanced Decent Homes standard might present some opportunities to combine it with other work that is perhaps seen as by tenants as having a more tangible benefit. So maybe it's the next round of kitchens or whatever it is that tenants would kind of accept.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just come to all of you actually, and I'll come to Brad in a minute, but is there an opportunity to, I mean, it wouldn't do it very quickly as Danny wants us to do, but, is there something that we can fit in terms of regulation or legislation here? Because, people don't mind if they're moving homes. So if you leave a home, or if, can with legislation or some incentive be there so that when somebody moves, whether it's a renter or owner, that house has to be, I mean, is that too sort of, or too top down? Is there ways in which we can do it through the sort of movement of people between? I'll talk to Brad about that. Do you think there's a sort of, is there an opportunity, or is it enough to incentivize people between moving from one property to another, that you could get in there, do stuff, and then that property would be sort of covered?
We have such a bottom-up governmental structure that it's hard for me to imagine a piece of legislation that would be enforceable in that fashion. We think about it a lot. We think about it especially with large commercial lease, like multi-floor leases and skyscrapers. What I wanted to add is that I've had to pioneer a new round of community outreach to residents and businesses in Boston because of our aggregated electricity supply purchase program, our municipal aggregation program, Community Choice Electricity. So we're legally required to reach residents in a very meaningful way to allow them to opt out and to stick with the existing utility for the utility supply. And so I have a new round of outreach that has done many, many webinars on how to avoid predatory individual supply sales jobs. So we're developing a new relationship with the residents and businesses of Boston of being a trusted source of information about energy. Yeah. And we had opt-out informational webinars translated into 12 different languages. I mean, so we really have recognized the very real need. We have to meet people where they are.
Yeah, and that the trusted source thing is vital, because there's so many, competing, sort of stuff coming in people's mind, that you do need a trusted source, really.
If I could say one more thing, my boss, Mayor Martin J. Walsh of Boston, is days away from being confirmed by the United States Senate to be the new Secretary of Labor.
Wow.
And so, we're very excited, obviously. Our international envoy is former Senator and Secretary of State John Kerry, who lives in Boston. Our domestic carbon advisor for President Biden is Gina McCarthy, the former EPA administrator. She's from Boston. There's a theme here. And we're very excited about our opportunity to give shape and direction to the spending.
And you've got some leading universities there. Who can,
32 institutions of higher learning within our 48 square miles. It's an amazing, Boston is an amazing city. I love it.
You don't need to sell it to me. You don't need to sell it to me.
I know that you love it too. That's wonderful. But what I wanted to say is that the federal spending that resulted in that experience of realizing we could not give away free retrofits. People would slam the door in our face and say, do not bother us ever again. I am hoping to bring my experience. I'm already in touch with the new secretary to be's chief of staff about these questions. And I say this with just the humility of my experience of door slams. I hope to bring this experience to the next round of federal spending in the United States so that we can think very comprehensively, more programmatically about, with the movement for energy justice and environmental justice really taking hold as part of the racial reckoning that the United States is truly in the middle of, truly. I think that there's a real opportunity for us to just get this general issue that I brought as part of my story, the sensitivity of touching people's homes and really thinking through what is involved. How much people power do you need in whatever organization is doing the retrofits to manage this? One last point, we installed heat pumps before they were climate ready for cold climates. Yeah. And I had people screaming at my face saying that they'd spent $15,000 to remove a heating system that didn't work. It's sensitive work.
It is, absolutely. The whole issue, we can't, let's move on to some of the other questions, but the behavioral aspect is really, and it's not just behavioral. In essence, as you just said, it's political.
Yeah.
There are some other questions around specific issues around the energy fact. So we got one is, what do we know about infrared heating? Does anybody know? Danny, do you know about infrared?
No, nothing.
No.
Right, well, we'll Brian?
Not a lot, no.
The other one is around hydrogen. So there's somebody actually, and I think Danny, you answered it, but there's something, is there research on the role of hydrogen in the sort of energy system, so anybody, Danny, you answered that to a degree. So the hydrogen factor, is that in the mix?
I mean, it's not something we modeled, but I think it certainly is in the long-term mix. Yeah, and it potentially is less disruptive if you can put that through the existing gas system. Yeah. I guess there's a question of scale. How many homes might you heat that way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually working on as a consultant to a big development in Cheshire, Runcorn, and they're looking at hydrogen as one of their. So I think it's sort of emerging as something to look at, but I don't think the panel has any. Brad, you haven't got any experience of hydrogen?
No, but I will say that we are thinking about the existing assets under the ground. I talked about our energy and infrastructure planning program.
Yeah.
We also are thinking about the future of labor. So we really do like technology advances that keep pipe fitters working. They're, you know, so yeah. And, you know, we have a big, huge district steam system in Boston. So we have to think about what assets we're willing to strand. You know, we're moving away from natural gas in a big way. We have a lot of concerns about what's going to be underneath our streets if everything is electrified. And so just from that general.
No. So that brings us on to another question around the skills agenda. And Brian, you brought this one up, and the question is actually for you, but I think we can all contribute. If you had the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund tomorrow, would you have the people with the skills to deliver it? And if not, what skills are missing, and who needs to be involved in creating that capacity to deliver that transformational programme? So I'll start with Brian, and then we can move around here.
Well, I mean, the answer is we could make a start. We certainly don't have the skills to deliver at the scale we need to. In terms of the skills we need, it's pretty much everything. You know, we need people who can deliver projects and programs. We need electricians for heat pumps. We still need people with plumbing skills, as Brad described, you know, because we're going to be replacing pipework and radiators. We need people who can install insulation inside homes, outside homes. We need skills like plasterers and carpenters as well. So it's right across the board, massive opportunities, big opportunities to diversify the workforce. This is a workforce that traditionally has been very white and male. Big opportunities there to involve tenants, to involve a more diverse workforce. Who needs to be involved? There's quite a chapter of this in the work we do with IPPR North. There's a big opportunity with the metro mayors to do at a city regional level, which makes sense from a travel to work point of view. It's the kind of city regional geography that you need to approach this at and making sure you have the skills in the right place. And I think the housing sector recognise we're not experts in the skills system, but we need to work with people like N8, people like the mayors who are, so that we can create a framework that's going to work.
I had another thought here, and this comes back to the fact that a lot of people do their own DIY. And so they're comfortable with doing their own electricity, their own gas, even though they might not, shouldn't. So, you know, there's that. Another thing, this comes back to this behavioural thing. So you've got to convince people to have it done. And then we also need to help them understand what they can and can't do and how they can be part of that co-decarbonisation of their homes, in a sense, isn't it? You know, so there's something there around that. And for us in the UK, there's an issue around, Danny, an issue here around education, you know, because, you know, we are educating at the university level, but there's a whole thing about the supply chain of in further education and apprenticeships and how we deliver that, I'm presuming. Danny, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think apprenticeships are a really exciting way to potentially upskill a whole set of people, and that could be people that, you know, have lost their jobs in the pandemic in hospitality and want to just do something completely different. So I think there's opportunities for people to kind of, young people to be able to shift, for people. I really liked what you said there on people are willing to do their own DIY. I think the idea of being able to almost empower communities to figure out what they can do themselves, and then helping them with, you know, the scaffolding you might want someone to come in and do because you need stuff, but actually there might be, you know, the elements that they are comfortable doing, and empowering them to do it, I think would, you know, if someone could have taught me how to do the external wall insulation, I'd have been well up for that, but I didn't know how to do it. And so I think there's a balance in kind of employment and empowerment. Yeah,
exactly. Is that the same in Boston, do you think, Brad? You know, communities engaged, you know, is that a way through, is getting communities to be engaged in it as well as training, upskilling people?
I think this is one of the most exciting opportunities that we have. Again, I think the, 26 years experience allows me to monitor where we are with the sort of the political and group dynamics of society. And climate was a marginalized issue that did not penetrate science to the sidewalk. Comment was 10 years ago. I would say that there's a much more broad-based willingness to think about why you need to upgrade your home. I think that we have enough, where legislation may have an opportunity is just massive resources for job training with programmatic direction as to having them reach all the communities in the city to diversify and bring energy justice and environmental justice. Our performance contracting program is generating so much work that I have a staff person who's created a building operator certificate training program, and that is half funded by the utilities, and something that really allows us to show that although this is for the retrofit of municipal buildings, that this program, which is entirely self-funded, so we're bringing tens and tens of millions of dollars to retrofit work, and it increased the demand for certain types of workers, and so we're actually just creating job training programs to fill that demand. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting. Okay, so given the scale and the pace of this innovation, well, actually, coming back to that, what you just said, I mean, actually, it illustrates the opportunity we've got post-COVID. There's a sort of, COVID is sort of, from what I've seen, COVID is obviously, a lot of communities have had to rely on their own to support themselves, and there's been a lot of communities being involved in dealing with the injustices and the inequities in their own communities, and people helping each other. So it's almost a matter of being able to build on that. So this comes back to our government's Build Back Better campaign, and how, okay, we've started to do some things well, like inoculations and getting action there. So it sounds to me like we need to sort of do the same thing, have that impetus. So one of the questions is, given the scale and pace of innovation required, all these homes that you're talking about, Danny, do the panel feel there's sufficient collaboration between the infrastructure, building sector disciplines to achieve net zero, and how do we work together better? So Brian, let's start with you.
I think there's some emerging models. So we're involved in the Northeast and the Northeast Climate Coalition, which is a cross-sector initiative to try and make that region England's greenest region. And that's involving the Chamber of Commerce, the water company, the housing sector through us, the universities and so on, and everybody working towards the same goal together. And I think that's beginning to create opportunities to have conversations across sectors. So I saw somebody this morning from the Nature Partnership about how we green estates and so on. And so I think there are definitely things beginning to bubble up, and it's that place-based approach. I think the North and and regions within the North, it's probably about the right geography to have those conversations. We're big enough to do something, but small enough to have those conversations at a more tangible level. Yeah.
Danny, what's your thought on the construction and the infrastructure industry and their collaboration? I know in the 1990s there was loads of work on partnering and collaboration amongst the industry, and I'll tell you, it isn't always the best. So I don't know how it's developed since.
I think around zero carbon, as Brian said, it's kind of emerging and it seems to be coming together. So there's a number of different I guess networks, you could call them, around either delivering zero carbon infrastructure, delivering zero carbon buildings, kind of circular economy buildings. And there seems to be, certainly in the last probably 2 years, I think there's been a bubbling of, well, why don't we work together more on this? And we need to do this. And that kind of urgency really is starting to come through in a way that when I started my PhD sort of 11, 12 years ago, everyone was like, why do you care about materials and embodied carbon? Like, what? So I think that really has changed, and that's quite exciting.
That's great. I mean, what is there a sort of, is the industries coming together in the US, in Boston, Brad?
Well, what this discussion reminds me of is way back in 1999, when we started the design of our trust-funded green building that we weren't even allowed to procure governmentally, a design build project. Yeah. Architects and engineers simply did not communicate with each other. Yeah. I'm a generalist. I have no background in what I do. I barely understand what I do when I go to work. I hire very smart people to integrate, to make all this happen. I think the zero carbon movement is just a huge integration of disciplines. And I would add to that these softer human disciplines. I think that architects, engineers, I think people really need to think about what it means for these technologies to actually make it into people's homes. I think we need to really think of the supply chain as including the human issues around administering comprehensive community-wide retrofits of everybody's residence. I mean, that's just again, just that basic message. But yes, I think the opportunity that we have to really train, and there's going to be a new era of federal spending in the United States. I cannot emphasize yesterday's enactment of the American Rescue Plan is the most significant change in American governmental philosophy since Ronald Reagan won. Yeah. So I cannot emphasize enough that the United States is heading in a different direction. I don't know if that answers your question, but in case you can't tell, I'm quite excited about it.
No, I'm so pleased about that, because on a personal note, my husband's from the US, and you know, we've always been thinking about coming back. So, but
we've been lost. We've been desperately lost. I mean, I'm a 14th generation American and I love this country, but we've been lost. And the country
may have been lost, but there's obviously some glimmers of hope in Boston and places like that. So
I really want to say that the combination of the racial reckoning with the climate change infrastructure upgrades, I think that's truly the opportunity. Yeah. We are getting appropriately demanded to make whatever happens more equitably fair for all people.
Yeah, I think we have this what we call leveling up agenda in the UK, and this is that leveling up, COVID, and the climate change crisis is a sort of tipping point.
One quick point. If you think touching a home is intimate, what about putting a jab in someone's shoulder? So we've just had this experience of government connecting with everybody. Yeah. So I'm very curious as to what will be the aftermath of that. We've had a very different human experience this year, the relationship of government and the individual.
Yeah.
So I just put that out as a thought. And to the challenge of touching people's residences.
So I think that's great. And I think actually coming back to, she's not here, but Lucy's diagram of people, place and technology. Yeah. And I would also say sort of politics with a small p, and policy.
We call it governance.
is part of that agenda. And I think we are, despite the fact that we've had a really tough year, there is some glimmer of hope on the horizon. Our government has just changed from getting rid of its industrial strategy to bringing back a new strategy, which is called Build Back Better, and it's zero carbon is in there. So we're hoping that the investment will come to the north of England, which is they're hoping to level up. So I'd like to thank everybody, thank the panelists, thank the participants for listening to us and watching us. And I hope it's stimulated everybody's idea of what we should do next. So before we close the event, I'd like to thank your contributions to letting us think about the challenges and opportunities for reducing emissions, improving sustainability and improving efficiency in the construction sector. Now, the NA Net Zero North is developing programs around energy efficiency, interacting with our natural and built environment, and wide-ranging skill program. And so if you want to support the Net Zero North program and you want to find out more about it, or you have any other questions, We will share the contact details of the team at N8, and we'll be more than happy to speak to you about potential collaborative opportunities. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and we hope you will join the conversation, that you will connect with N8, you will connect with the universities across the N8, and you will work together with us to drive this agenda, this net zero agenda, forward collaboratively across the North, and ensure we get our funding out of the government to do it, and hold hands across the ocean with our partners in the US. And hopefully I shall be over there soon, because my daughter lives in LA, so I'm missing her a lot. Anyway, thank you everybody for a great webinar. Thank you for our speakers again, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you everybody.